Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. So we should be starting momentarily as everyone's coming into the session. So everyone who's connected should be seeing my screen right now. So I don't know if you want to do a thumbs up to say if you have seen or not. Excellent. Thank you very much for confirming. So I believe. Excellent. So to be respectful of everyone who's already joined, I'm actually going to be starting the session right away. And if people do join us, we'll welcome them as they come in with no wait period. So, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending this session on anticipating potential disruptions. My name is Mary Helen Primo, and I'll be the one speaking today. I am Executive Vice President at Premier Continuum, and I am been working in the field of business continuity for more than 20 years now. Been an instructor for the BCI, as well as former president of the BCI Canada chapter, and has been quite involved in standards development as well. But it's not going to be all about standards. We want to make this dynamic. So welcome to our webinar series that we called Insights at Premier Continuum. And the idea is to have actionable insights for resilience professionals, so valuable information that you'll be able to bring back to your day-to-day business. So it's Exchange Forum, Idea Generator, and really, we do have a area with teams for the Q&A and a chat. So I do invite you to use those two venues to collaborate during this session today. And hopefully you bring back some concrete solutions into your organization. Just a few words on Premier Continuum. Well, we've been in business for more than 25 years. We have three lines of business. We are a software provider, so we do have a solution, Parasolution, which assists you in managing your business continuity program, as well as responding at time of incidents, and also related fields, so included IT, DR, as well as operational risk as well, and UpRes. We're also training partners of the Business Continuity Institute. We also have a partnership with ICOR, and we offer consulting services. I do see that there's a question. I know, Chad, I don't know if you're able to unmute yourself or... So I don't know if it's expected or not. Well, maybe it's the hand shouldn't be raised, but if ever, okay, so I think it's a mistake. Thank you, Chad. So here you go. So I do invite you, and I do invite you to reach out to us if you do want to have further information about our organization. So the key elements that we're going to be covering in today's session for the next 55 minutes is, potential disruptions on the horizon, a variety of methodologies and tools to foresee and prepare disruptions, what AI can also do in anticipating as well as responding, and have actually actionable insights on how to prepare effectively. So before, going more into the detail, I wanted to touch base on, the disruptions. So when we talk about disruptions, well, there could be a various magnitude. So it could be something very small, such as problem management that IT would have, or it could be something as severe as a crisis that could involve the organization. The actual emergency, and as well with a spectrum of emergency incident management. Within your organization, you may have different terminology, so it's important to be clear on what's expected and what's meant within your organization. But disruptions can be of a few hours or it could be a few days, few months, and leading into years if we think of COVID. But depending on what you'll be developing from a business continuity standpoint could be enhancing your tool set to respond to these various durations. We don't want business continuity to be about everything, but if you do have some simple workarounds, they can be very valuable as well. Talking about that, there's also a definition between incident and crisis. Again, you might be using different terms. These two definitions actually are descriptors come from the ISO 22361, which was published back in 2022. How one is differentiated from the other is the fact that incidents tend to be more predictable, that we have a course plan of action that we can follow, and typically it'll require less involvement from the strategic team within an organization. Whereas crisis may come, from an angle that we haven't thought about, might be a combination of incidents together as well, or consequences that we hadn't foreseen. Typically requires the involvement of top management to have some strategic orientation, and it does require flexibility, creativity, and maybe a sustained response as well, so that it doesn't have a short duration. I mean, these are valuable information, and talking about, referencing to standard, it's actually a great standard to look at, a technical specification, one of which, within the process, it actually details that anticipation, assessment, prevention, preparedness, as well as response recovery. So indicating that, response and recovery are actually just not even half of the cycle of the process. If we can anticipate and even assess, either what we've anticipated or elements that we have considered within the organization, well, we'll be able to implement some preventive measures as well as better prepare so that we have better response and recovery. But you can clearly see that anticipation does have a place within the process. In terms of the and leading to other standards as well. So ISO 22361 is a technical specification, but I think it's good to go back to basics. If you haven't looked at the ISO 22301, that's the requirements. It was updated back in 2019 with the guidance of 22313. And then there are other standards or technical specifications that were that were developed, and from an anticipation response structure, it's very valuable to look at what the crisis management technical specification covers. And I'd like to also point out that I really like what was in the supply chain continuity technical specification. So if you did want to go and take a look at that, well, that's would be a good insight as well. And well, I did mention I was an instructor for the Business Continuity Institute, so I wouldn't be able to go through the actual session without even mentioning the BCMS. So the the system that was recently published back in 2023. Really, anticipation is something that obviously comes into play when you're talking about establishing the BCMS, because you anticipate that you might have some outages, but definitely that's something that we do cover in the analysis. And if you do have elements that you foresee, then it'll have a ripple effect on solutions design, as well as enabling solutions where we're actually going to be invoking the plans, and validation would be where the exercises take place. And the more people that do contribute to the process and that are embracing business continuity will give us more insight as to what we could anticipate and better prepare as well. And I can go more into the topic of today without talking about what our expectations are from a business continuity standpoint. I don't know the people here attending the session, what are your knowledge of business continuity. I expect that most of you are knowledgeable in business continuity, but just wanted to put some, some values or acronyms on a slide. So when we're talking about that disruption, typically we'll want to bring back business to a minimum level first, and then return it back to normal. So depending on our expectations, well, we might want to be back, within very short time frame, which would be the recovery time objective, and the maximum total period of disruption would be, well, if we go beyond that timeline, well, we'd actually be in big trouble. Not meaning death, but meaning that there are going to be some consequences that will be of a long duration. So obviously, if we give ourselves lots of leeway between the time the disruption occurs and the recovery time objective, well, we have more luxury of being able to adjust and to make plans on the go before the actual time comes. But nowadays, with you know 24/7, the fact that even if we're a retailer, well, we may have some clients that are putting their orders online to have our product. We need to have more availability, so recovery time objectives do tend to be shorter, and there's an expectations that we've planned accordingly. So these are things to take into consideration. This is great insight that you'll get from your performing your business impact analysis, and having a good understanding of what are your capabilities when you're doing your solutions design. So how do we anticipate, assess, and prevent? So there's various various elements to take into consideration as we are doing this effort within the organization so that we can be better positioned. First, doing the risk assessment. So again, you did see my appreciation for standards. So there is a framework, which is the ISO 31000, which defines how we should be addressing risk. I think now it's common practice. People are very familiar with that. But just to take in consideration that when you're doing a risk assessment, these are the various steps that you should consider. So first of all, understanding what the scope and the business context in order to do the proper risk assessment. Then you'll have to identify what the risks are, the risk analysis, performing the risk evaluation, then putting some risk treatment in, and one step that's actually not mentioned there is when you're doing the first go in, when you're doing the risk assessment, well, you'll calculate an inherent risk, but when you're considering your different risk treatments, so what are the measures you're putting in place so that you're also calculating your seeing what's actually left. We call this a residual risk. So that's also something that you need to take in consideration. And then make sure that you're doing reporting, that you're recording those results, communicating them, getting people involved as well in the assessment, and that obviously this is something that needs to be reviewed over time. Wanted to say something about risk treatment and that actual element of considering, what's your actual inherent risk and residual risk. I know there's lots of talks about should we do both, and sometimes it's really hard to discriminate between inherent risk and residual risk. But more importantly, you need to be conscious that sometimes some of the risk treatments that you're putting in place might have an impact on you might increase your risk eventually. This example is starting to get old, but it's from 2011 when there was the earthquake in Japan, which then triggered the tsunami. Well, there was a city called Taru that had actually created seawalls to protect itself from the tsunamis, but that time around the wall wasn't high enough. So instead of protecting the city, it actually created more damage because the water got inside and wasn't even able to leave the site. So that's something to also be conscious about when you're putting in place your risk treatment, is that they can be very beneficial, but on the other hand, they might create additional risk or additional impacts. When we talk about recording and reporting, one of the a key tool is actually the heat map. So if that's not something that you've implemented within your organization, it does talk a lot to the executive management, the heat map. They're very comfortable and knowledgeable of that. But what's kind of the issue or the concern with the heat map is that sometimes it's hard to consider, you know, with the probability, especially because it tends to depend on historical data. And the impact, well, depends on the length, depends on what's exactly affected, what's the duration of and the timing. If it's during a peak period, for example, that could have some impacts. And we tend to be addressing within business continuity things that are more, you know, very impactful, but with a lower probability. So those are elements that we do need to take into consideration as you know, we're looking into that. But definitely, it's a good tool. You may have one that's for your inherent risk as well as your residual risks. And also understanding the evolution is typically something that the top management will like to see from a board perspective, for example. And I'd say that when I started back in business continuity 20 years ago, we tended really to be in those really, you know, very low probability, very high impact. But nowadays, you know, going back to the point I was making earlier about the fact that our tolerance to interruption is much shorter, there is an expectation that will be there. We tend to prepare for incidents that are smaller in size, but still disrupt the business. So heat maps and typical or, you know, traditional risk assessments do tend to focus on the elements that we're aware of, that we know about, and don't necessarily, you know, consider those black swan events. To help you, you know, think ahead, there are some different tools that do exist. For example, the Business Continuity Institute provides on an annual basis a Horizon Scan report, which highlights, you know, what are other professionals thinking of what could be occurring in the next 12-month period. It's interesting to see that, you know, in 2022 it's very it was very tainted by COVID because you had the non-occupational disease, but you know, cyber attacks remain something of a day-to-day, unfortunately, that's nowadays happening. So the cyber attacks, regulatory changes. But what's also interesting to see now, point in the Horizon Scan, is interruption of energy and the increased cost of living. So we're broadening the scope to things that are not necessarily business continuity, and considering that increased cost of living could, you know, create some issues with some civil disturbances, for example. Another source is also the Global Risk Report that the World Economic Forum publishes every January. If you haven't looked at this report, it's available free of charge. And it does provide some very nice graphs and information that top management does like to see. The information, so what's interesting here in this one is the top 10 risks, and you can see that extreme weather events for the 10-year period is seen as the top risk. Climate and critical changes to Earth system, biodiversity. Obviously, there's some that actually don't necessarily relate to business continuity, but adverse outcomes of AI, as well as cyber insecurity, were top concerns that also do have impact on the actual continuity of our business. One that I'd like to point out is misinformation and disinformation. I know that I had some questions when showing this to clients, where misinformation would be not to have the proper information available, or being not having the actual all the information available to be able to take informed decision, whereas disinformation is more like deep fake or having distorted information that someone purposefully provides you information that is wrongful. So those are all information to help you in doing your horizon scan, making sure that you're thinking ahead and not just looking at the things that you're just used to seeing. Early warning system can also be very beneficial to help you in anticipating disruptions. So be able to know earlier on what's happening. Typically, they come from government, and it does give you some time to analyze, implement the response, and it gives you that extra time that you may, be worth. Like if you know a hurricane's coming, you might put some uh, so you might protect your windows, and you might put yourself in a shelter. Well, hopefully you will. So these are things that you'll think about. But sometimes weak signals might not be captured, and things that we aren't tracking would not necessarily be detected as well. But if you can tap into those resources, that can definitely be making a difference in order to not be the last one prepared. And to that leads into the media monitoring. So which is also something that if you're doing the media monitoring and not just focusing on what's happening within your surroundings, well, it might also give you hints of things that you should start preparing for. For example, when COVID hit, the ones that were actually monitoring what was going on in China were a few steps ahead, and were able to have the actual masks and have proper or additional preparation time, I'd say, or access to material that became scarce after. So the process for media monitoring is actually having, being on the lookout, what's going out in the, in the social networks, as well as what's going on the traditional media, to see if there's any additional development, to see if there's anything as well that's being said about us, and could be things that we might want to correct. Because another element in terms of how we are seen successful when we're handling a crisis is actually our reputation. And if our reputation is as gone bad or is not as good as it used to be, well, this will taint the perception that people will have of us. So if we can address and make sure that we don't have any skeletons in the closet, and that we're having a good relationship with our customers and clients, well, then it's actually going to be very helpful for our perception of our resolution of the crisis. And then artificial intelligence comes into the mix. So artificial intelligence can be, you know, used in various fashions. It could be used to help you in doing that media monitoring. So being able to take the feeds from what's happening in the news, be able to rate them, and be able to better anticipate. So that could be, and that's something that we're actually working on at Premier Continuum to enhance and add within Parasolution. There's also, the tools could also be there to assist you in being a co-pilot to your program. But something that you need to be careful about is all the predictive values and what the actual AI is proposing. So you want to avoid it and hallucinating. So you want to ask about the proofs, where the actual information is coming from, so that you have a better understanding of, should I be, taking this into account or not? I remember having a conversation comparing that. It's the artificial intelligence. It's like a kid that's being asked a question in school. Rather than not saying anything, it'll say something. So you want to make sure that what's being said is actually truthful. something to also think when you're, integrating AI into your way of operating is that you might need to also consider contingency for when AI doesn't work. So it might be a system that you'll need to also plan for recovery if you're becoming highly dependent upon artificial intelligence. But definitely artificial intelligence need to be considered and could help you just in thinking of what could go wrong. I know I've used it for building scenarios for exercises where I was mentioning a certain territory and asking, well, what could go wrong from this standpoint and could have a duration of X, Y, Z. So, I mean, it's just another input that you need to think about and, tap on, but don't make it be the pilot. It needs to remain a co-pilot to your process. In other considerations, and I've been talking a lot about this with our clients lately, where they're being asked to consider where does business continuity contribute to sustainable development as well as climate change. So we did use this diagram that's inspired by the IPCC, where, considering the risk and likelihood as well as so based on the hazards and the likelihood, what could the impact be? And seeing how business continuity as well as emergency response, crisis management, and all these different plans that you're seeing above could be helpful in making sure that the organization, is getting prepared, putting the measures in place to prevent, but also making sure that there's adjusting maybe its business model to be able to be sustainable over time. And, it's not typically a mix that we were doing, but this is a board concern at the moment. So this is definitely something that you should be thinking about, how you can have the similar language that they are using within the organization. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the session. So if you want to, tap more into that topic or any of the ones that we've covered so far, it'll be my pleasure to talk about that. When, so we talked about what could go wrong and how, we can find some sources of information to understand better what could go wrong, assess it, have an idea of the different elements that would be that could impact us, and now we need to be ready, otherwise there wouldn't be business continuity, right? So we need to have response structures in place, be able to alert and mobilize people, having access to notification systems, having the plans and the solutions in place and the exercises. So that's key, right? Otherwise we're going to be stuck in the boardroom and saying, well, I knew about it, but didn't do anything about it. Hopefully you'll get the proper budget and the proper resources to implement what you've found. So all these steps are key in order to make sure that you can then prepare appropriately. So from a response structure, I really like, the displaying different levels of involvement that are required when an incident occurs. There are different structures that exist. The ICS has a structure which is defined in the NFPA 1561 with the incident command. Here, I like this one because it's simple. Defining that there are some considerations when you're handling a situation, an incident, a crisis, which are at the strategic level, tactical, and operational. Obviously, there might be a mix of situations where, it might not just be fully, tactical. You might need a bit of involvement from strategic, but to be clear as to what's expected. So strategic would typically be what's oversight and reputation, tactical be coordination, and operational is really doing. So typically the business units will be positioned there within your actual response structure. In the UK, the emergency, there's a framework which is, based on gold, silver, and bronze. So that's another way of portraying that. I don't personally like calling the people that are operational bronze, but that's a model that do exist within some organizations and works well for them. So what's important to capture there is that if you've done your homework previously, so if there's an understanding what the risks are and that we've anticipated them, that we've performed business impact analysis, that we've laid out plans, and we'll see later about the different criterias. Well, we want to keep the strategic level, so top management at the strategic level. But for that, we need to have had their approval of other elements. Otherwise, we'll need to go back to them every time to seek approval, get further information. And then really the role of coordination, and that's typically where the business continuity manager will be involved, is more at the tactical level, and ensuring that both the strategic and the operational are aligned and are aware of what's expected to be delivered, getting the orders and making sure that the orders are being executed. In terms of the actual escalation flow, well, depending on the different levels of incident that you've defined within your organization, well, it's good to have a clear view as to when everyone's going to get involved. Those names could vary within your organization, depending if you're a global or a local organization with multiple sites. This will also come into play as to what would be managed at which level. So you might have an overlay of the response structures I was showing earlier. So those may have an impact as well in terms of the different levels, but so that people just understand, when they would actually be invoked. And you may want to have also some definitions of, what would land within that level 1, level 2, and level 3, but not making it of a square. If it doesn't fit, we want people to be proactive and let you know that they need to be involved, rather than just saying, well, it doesn't fit the box, we won't be activating. Better be safe than sorry. Talking about emergency communication system, well, to be able to reach out to people in a very short period of time, there was actually a report issued by the PCI on the crisis communication, which indicated that most people want to reach out to their teams within a 5-minute time frame. Well, if you're not leveraging any technology, you won't be able to meet that 5 minutes, but you might be able to get to the 30-minute time frame if ever you have lots of resources, but be able to reference and be able to reach out to people at speed is key, especially nowadays with the speed of media. I was attending a conference a few months ago where the person from an organization from Canadian Tire, which is a very large retailer in Canada, had a major fire within their main distribution center in the Toronto area. And it took them, it started off with a fire. The guy from the business continuity manager actually got a phone call for someone within the distribution center within a few minutes, but they thought it was a false alarm, and it was. And their actual management is based in Alberta, which is not even the same province, and they called a few minutes later asking about what was going on because they had seen it on the media. So you need to make sure that you can reach out to people, that you're able to mobilize them, because news goes very fast, especially if you have people that are doing media monitoring. So you want to be efficient in notifying, getting your act together, getting people notified. You want to look at different ways of communicating with people as well, because the channels may be crowded when an actual incident occurs. The another component to think about is all the solutions. So when, I did give some examples of situations that may occur, but I do like to, I in my practice, I recommend the client to do planning mostly based on the actual consequences, where you're focusing on loss of access to premise or the premise themselves, loss of employees, the disruptions of key business partners, the loss of resources, loss of IT or communications. So the cause of the interruption is not as important as the consequences it may have on the organization. Obviously, if you might need to have some specific response plan. I was giving the example of a hurricane. Well, you do need to know what you need to do when a hurricane hits, but this is a specific plan. It's only a portion of the business that need to be made aware of this. But for the general bulk of the business units, well, they need to know what they'll do if they don't have access to the premise, or if the premise is destroyed, or if they don't have any power, or so really focusing it on the resources makes it much more agile and makes it more it less cumbersome to maintain and probably less list to build. If we again take the example of COVID, I'll have to switch my example shortly because now it's becoming old examples. But when COVID hit, well, the typical pandemic plans that organizations were building was actually loss of 35% of their staff. That was the general assumption, that people would not be available to work. But in most organizations, it was actually the loss of access to the premise that was the most the biggest impact. So these are things that need to be taken in consideration. If you're an organization that's highly dependent on its facilities, for example, if we think of that distribution center, well, if it's loss of access or if it's loss of the premise, well, it's two different worlds in terms of the impacts that are covered. So in those cases, we do recommend splitting them. But if you're really not that dependent on your facility, well, maybe you can combine them. And that, to that point, having, specific plans can definitely be of a, or plans that are generic and help you out in sending and having addressing these items are important. So talking about the business continuity plans are actually the response plans that you are building and to address those disruptions that you may be anticipating. Well, having people involved in the entire process and the planning process. So having people that had sat at the table and looking at what the risks are, as well as the impacts on the organization, will make people more comfortable with the plans and be able to adapt if when the actual incident occurs. And really, we want to have plans that are, detailed enough to be operationalized, but not too lengthy. So you don't want to be writing a book on your organization, but you want it to be as relevant as possible, and you want people to be able to reference at that speed, to be action oriented. So if you can use your plans when you're doing your exercises, making sure that people go back to the plans so that they read it, it will make them more comfortable when they need to use it. Here I've put the criteria that are in the Good Practice Guidelines version 7. There used to be less points than those, but now there are new ones that were added. So direct is really, be able to be to the point. We don't want to know too much detail. We want to be to the point. Adaptable conveys what I was just saying about the actual the focusing on consequences rather than very specific. You want them to be concise, relevant. So not to be talking about something that doesn't relate to the business. And to that point, you might have within your organization, there are some organizations that have one single business continuity plan, just a single document. But most often, each business unit will have its own copy of the business continuity plan. So if you're focusing on what's important to them, what's relevant to them, well, the chances of people reading it through and using it are much higher so that it remains relevant to them. Verifiable, well, you want to make sure that what's written there is something that we could check. Too often I've seen some plans where people have put a strategy and a solution in, and they've actually not, it's not ready, it's not in place. So it's a good idea that they had. I remember once they were saying, well, if I don't have access to the premise, well, we'll relocate. Okay, well, where are you relocating? What technology do you need? That's just wishful thinking if you haven't signed any agreement or if you haven't detailed anything. So it's important that it be something that we can check, that someone else could actually also be able to look at and be able to also understand. You want it to be in a in an order that makes sense as well, so that you can reference it SP to that point, and unambiguous, that meaning that if someone else reads it, well, they'll have the same understanding. So that's definitely something that you want to take into consideration within your plan. And, these are examples of checklists that you could also have. So these are, from a crisis management as well as generic incident task. Also having an understanding of what are people doing, who's in charge, is there any backups that are required and the time that it's expected for things to take. So these are all elements, to think about. You might not necessarily want to crowd your plans with that, but to be able to be conscious that things may take more time, and especially if your lead time to determine that you're invoking your crisis management team or your different layers of management of an incident is taking longer than expected, well, you might, it will take you more time to recover, obviously, from the time that disruption occurred. Please do leverage information from what was gathered in the business impact analysis and understanding, what are the solutions that are in place, the dependencies that may occur. So if you have a better understanding, if there's a concentration of risks, into that point, if you've done, if you're in the manufacturing world, you may have done even some failure mode, analysis where if this falls, what are the knock-on effect of this? So understanding where your single points of failure are, understanding what's the different implications of if one goes down, what can go also down, or what comes after the other, will also help you in the sequencing and the ordering of your different plans. And also understanding, how much time you have on your hands to, address. Regarding the solutions that we spoke just before, well, if you have built solutions, if your maximum tolerable period of disruption is 72 hours and you intend to be back within 24 hours, you should also consider that your solutions that you're putting in place should give you some leeway. So those solutions should not just be for the next, the next 24 hours. Otherwise, you're actually going to go back to the table and have to figure out what you're going to do for that critical process. So if you already have an ordering of who's going to be, which are the business functions, which are the processes that need to be back into business, in which time frame, and that you have solutions that are in place, which will help you meet those requirements. And I typically provide, or I provide an advice that the solutions that you're putting in place should be good for at least, 7 days to 30 days, so that it gives you some leeway to think about the ones that hadn't planned yet, because you're not necessarily going to be building plans for all your business units within your organization, your various groups. So it's important to also take that into account, that if you're keeping it to the minimum, what you're putting in place for your strategies, and well, you're not going to give you any reading space. So those are elements to also think here. This diagram here shows where we have some issues with the resilience level. So it allows you to focus on where the issues are, and that you can also raise those with top management in advance of your actual incident occurring. And then, having tracking of what the steps are required, as well as understanding what your risks are and your impacts are, will also enable you some collaboration in real time. So if you have put in place a structure that you're able to reach out to your various units to be able to have the information in, well, that's going to be great, and also help you in your the value that you provide to the organization. So this is also something to think about, that if you have information, that will be an expectation when you're responding to an incident to have a status of what's going on. So you could leverage tools with notification, with having a survey, asking people to know where they stand. And then, the last element of our planning process before the actual incident occurs is actually practicing, because we don't want to be creating a disaster just for the sake of testing if our plan works. So, I do encourage you to perform exercises. I did mention earlier that if you can even leverage AI to help you in building your scenarios, or at least giving you some ideas to think outside the box. And, things such as simple as doing a discussion-based exercise where you're having someone looking at your plan, seeing if there's any discrepancies, can be very helpful. So to be sure that it's unambiguous. Also doing some individual tests, as well as some end-to-end tests to understand, well, are there any angles that we haven't covered. Doing also some evacuation exercises, just so that we're able to be in a state of readiness, or alert and mobilization exercises where we know that we can reach out to people, but just don't stick to that. You need to go beyond that, and look at various scenarios, various consequences that may affect the business. Because the more that we train that muscle, the more that we do exercises, more chances that people will actually use them when an actual incident occurs. And if there are some opportunities to use the measures that we're putting in place to even enhance the business as usual, well, that's definitely something that we encourage you to do. So in terms of the takeaways that we had for today's session, is that I think, disruptions will occur. It used to be, especially, that we've maybe increased the scope of what disruption is, and the fact that now our tolerance to interruption is much lower than it used to be. And the evolving risk with, cyber attacks happening, the nature of the risk, the vulnerability, these are all, elements that you need to take into considerations. Obviously, our role as business continuity managers is to be more of a facilitator, to be blowing the whistle if something goes wrong. I actually had, I was having a conversation with a neighbor that works in cybersecurity, and he was saying that his title is chief whisperer within the organization. I mean, it's not his official title, but that's what he likes to say, of being the one behind your shoulder and telling you, well, don't forget, this could happen. So it's our role to do that. And to that point, if you maybe missed the boat with business continuity and it remains a silo within your organization, well, operational resilience, organizational resilience might be that new buoy, so that you're breaking silos within the organization. Because when an incident occurs, it's not just the work of one group, it's the work of the entire organization, with delegation of authority to specific individuals. But really, you cannot be managing the entire organization. And if everyone's on board in terms of understanding what the risks are, understanding, the measures that are in place and the solutions that we could implement, as well as the plans, this will definitely be a more resilient organization. Um, you know, we don't want to be also letting our head in the sand and having, risk treatment not being put in place. So if there are things that can be put in place, I had a client that a few months ago, they actually had a power outage that was, very short duration. I think it was the transformer blew out, and the actual interruption lasted 4 hours, but they didn't have any, or their UPS was not sufficient for their server, or no one thought of powering down the server. So it took them an additional 4 hours for the system, for the server to reboot, because it had not well shut down when the incident occurs. So now they're looking at having a generator, or at least a better UPS for that, so that it doesn't have this ununderstandable impact from a business standpoint. So if there are things that you can do so that you don't have to go into invoking your plans, well, please do so. And going back to that board concern, well, sustainable development, or being asked about doing risk assessments, enterprise risk management, we have really, really good information that's being gathered in the business impact analysis, understanding better what the business does. So and if you don't say anything to them, they might think everything's under control. But if there are some issues, please ensure that there are pathways upwards so that you can actually share the information, or that someone, your champion within your organization, will be able to go and provide that information, because they're being asked. It's something that they have on the board, be it from a cybersecurity standpoint. So you want to have a coordinated effort within the organization. And, just reemphasizes the fact that we have access to a wealth of information. We should, not be preview of this information, make sure that we're breaking silos, and that organization just, will win from this. So as I said, we now have time for a Q&A, but just before we do the Q&A, just wanted to mention that we'll have another webinar session coming our way in November, which will be specific on strategies development. So thinking of maybe having categorization of the various various strategies, so we could have a sequence of strategies, as well as how do we assess, what are the criteria. So that will be the topic of the November session. So thank you for your time today. And as I said, we do have a Q&A area. So if there are any questions that I've been actually seeing that there are, so I'm actually going to go and read them. But if you have other questions that come along, please don't hesitate. So the question, how important this is to analyze fourth parties that could affect business continuity. With fourth parties, I mean suppliers of the third parties. How extensive should be how extensive should be supply chain risk assessment? What do you recommend that it should include? Well, actually, with the regulations, I know that here in Canada, it's actually asking even about your our supplier's supplier to understand if there's concentration of risk, even more if it's a cloud provider. I mean, not cloud provider, but it's a cloud solution that's relying on a provider such as AWS or our other providers of infrastructure as a service. So I think, well, first of all, you need to understand who your suppliers are and what your dependency is on those suppliers. But just experience shows us, with the CrowdStrike issue a month ago, where it wasn't just, it was the fact that people were using Microsoft and using CrowdStrike that they weren't able to provide. So going a bit deeper into the details of the actual ability, or here there's actually a scare of a strike on the railway system. Well, it's the provider, or it's the transit or the conveyor that's used to get the product in. So I think understanding better what goes down in the supply chain, if we can get to that, be ideal, but often just getting that first layer is hard. So start for the first layer, but then if you have, if you can have the supply chain team involved as well, be great. I remember there was at one point there was an outage in some of the medication because one of the molecules that was used was actually produced in India, and all the providers and all the manufacturers were dependent upon that supplier. Same with the chips right now, and that's why there's actually a movement to increase chips capabilities in the U.S. so that we're not as dependent on Taiwan and other countries for the chips that are required within our electronic devices. So yes, but start first with what's close to home. Make sure that you have your plans for what's internal. But yes, if you can anticipate, look what's going on in the regions. So regarding the tools for Horizon Scan for AI, well, obviously just querying with ChatGPT or Copilot may give you, can be a good source, but it's good actually to ask once they give you what the Horizon Scan, to ask what the sources are, so that you can actually go and read the source to see if there's anything that the source can give you some some more interpretation to what's being said. And now there's more and more tools. As I said, that's something that we're working on at Premier Continuum within Parasolution to have leveraging AI to assist you what others are doing with having people check and rate incidents. In terms of the so I believe there were some issues so that the chat was disabled. But if there are any information, I'm actually going to go and see in the chat if there are some further questions. I see there was lots of action here in the chat as well. So we have an AI assistance that there for note taking. So that's also information that you can also use in order to help you for AI. Just make sure that what you're doing for AI, think about privacy and all these confidential information. So I actually had attended a session back in June where they used deepfake and used how even the information that you're putting into ChatGPT, even though someone could hack into that system and use it and change it for something that becomes a crisis. So be careful about what you're sharing, and be sure that your settings are properly put in place so that you're not creating a crisis with your actual usage of AI. I'm seeing we have people from various parts of the world, so I'm happy that you attended this session. If there are, here we had some other, thank you for the feedback. And if you do want to have access to the PDF and the recording, Jeremy from our team is also on the call. Is going to send you an email after having participated in today's session. And if you do want to have access to the recording as well as the PowerPoint of today's session, it'll be you can reach out to him and he'll be able to provide to you for sure. And I think it does cover the various elements that people have raised. I'm just going to go back to Q&A there. So excellent. So I think I've covered all the questions that were listed. So I hope you found this session helpful, useful for your organization, that you'll be able to implement within your organization. If you do have any further questions, if you want to reach out to us, well, you do have my LinkedIn information here, so you can definitely reach out and message me, or you can also connect with our LinkedIn page and access our website at Premier Continuum. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in today's session, and I'll give you back some extra 3 minutes in your day.